The Texas air crackled with the dryness of broken promises. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, but there was no beauty in the light that fell upon the green ranch. There was only the long shadow of horses and men who did not belong. General Marshal Merritt, astride his black stallion, was a stain of arrogance against the landscape. His broad shoulders, crammed into an immaculate uniform, seemed to bear the full weight of authority, but his eyes, small and calculating, revealed a soul devoid of honor. He looked at the simple wooden house, at the woman standing on the porch, and saw only a nuisance, a final detail to be swept from the map of his profits. "Mrs. Green," he said, his voice sounding too polished for the dust that rose, "I believe we have exhausted the time for pleasantries. The decree is clear. This land now serves the interests of progress." Eleanor Green remained motionless. Her hands, calloused by a lifetime of work, did not tremble. They rested, relaxed, on the worn porch railing. She did not look at the paper one of the soldiers held, an official document that was, in fact, a bill of sale for theft. Instead, her eyes fixed on the general's. They were eyes that had witnessed the joy of a calf's birth and the pain of burying a husband too young. Eyes that held the memory of every season, every drought, and every bountiful harvest that this land had given them. Marshal Merritt smiled, a thin, condescending gesture. He was accustomed to seeing fear bloom on the faces of settlers. Fear was his most effective tool, sharper than any bayonet. But in those eyes, there was no fear. There was something older, deeper, a calm that irked him. "I offered a fair price, ma'am, more than fair. To reject the government's generosity is an act of foolishness or treason." The word treason hung in the hot air, an insult that made Eleanor's blood boil in silence. A fleeting image, a ghost of memory flashed in her mind. Her husband, Matthew Barrett Green, standing beside that very same gnarled oak tree that stood on the hill. He would run his hand over the earth and smile. "This ground breathes with us, Eleanor," he had told her years ago. "It holds every promise we made to each other. It's more than land. It's our testament." Now, a stranger with gleaming buttons and a heart of stone was here to desecrate that testament. General Merritt had already done the same to other families, families who, one by one, had yielded, intimidated, impoverished, exhausted. They took the few coins he offered and disappeared, becoming dust on the road. Everyone obeyed, everyone, until now. Eleanor had already noticed the signs months before. The increased presence of soldiers in town, the whispered conversations about a new development plan coming from the capital, the unfamiliar surveyors measuring the boundaries of neighboring properties. She had ignored it, as many had, believing in justice, in the promise of a free Texas that men like her father had fought for, a blind loyalty that now felt like a betrayal of herself. "You have until Friday sunrise," the general continued, losing patience with her silence. "After that, my men will help you pack, with or without your cooperation." He nodded. Two soldiers dismounted and, with hammer and nails, affixed the eviction order to the fence post Matthew had built with his own hands. The sound of the hammering echoed through the valley. Each beat a nail in the coffin of her home. As the general's entourage rode away, kicking up a cloud of red dust, the soldiers laughed amongst themselves. Merritt didn't even bother to look back. To him, the battle was won. He had broken the spirit of dozens of proud men with threats and paperwork. What could a lone woman do? Eleanor didn't watch them leave. Her gaze was fixed on the hill, on the old oak. It was there that Matthew had told her the stories his grandfather used to tell, tales of Davy Crockett and the men of the Alamo. Men who knew certain things were priceless and couldn't be sold. Men who understood that true strength wasn't in the noise you made, but in the line you drew in the sand and from which you didn't retreat. Merritt saw only a stubborn woman on a dusty patch of land. He couldn't understand that in Texas, silence is never a sign of surrender. It's the calm before the storm, the silent concentration of a promise that will be paid in full. And Eleanor Green, standing on her porch as the sun died on the horizon, had just made a silent promise to the ghost of her husband and to the land that breathed with her. The general had started a war, but he had no idea what battlefield he had chosen. The days that followed were a lesson in silent cruelty. General Merritt didn't need overt violence to crush Eleanor. He was a master of slowly strangling the life out of things. The first measure was to divert the small creek that fed Eleanor's well and fields. A ditch dug by soldiers in a few hours turned life-giving water into a weapon. The earth began to crack under the relentless sun. The corn, once green and vibrant, drooped, then yellowed, finally withering into brittle stalks. Then came the isolation. In town, the general's power was absolute. The merchants who once bought Eleanor's eggs and milk now averted their gaze when she approached. The blacksmith who serviced her tools was suddenly too busy. The women with whom she shared recipes and church gossip now crossed the street to avoid her. Fear was a poison Merritt dripped into the community's well. They all drank from it one by one. She became a specter, a walking warning of the price of disobedience. The general, arrogant in his impunity, made a point of riding down the main road passing in front of the Green Ranch. He wouldn't stop, wouldn't say anything. He'd just look, a satisfied smirk on his lips, at the visible signs of decay. Every dead plant, every gaunt rib showing on the thin cattle was a trophy for him. He wanted her to suffer, to feel despair gnaw at her resolve. He wanted her to come to him on her knees, begging to accept the coins he had offered. One night, sitting in the darkness of her kitchen, the last candle burning low, hunger churning in her stomach, Eleanor felt the weight of loneliness like a stone in her chest. It was then that another memory came, an even older one. She was a girl, and her father held her on his shoulders. He gave her a small amulet he had kept for years, a miniature coonskin cap, crudely carved from wood. A man who rode with Crockett himself gave this to your grandfather, he said, his voice grave and gentle. Remember, child, courage isn't about making noise. It's not about being the strongest or the tallest. It's about being the last one standing, even when everyone else has sat down. She still kept that little amulet in a wooden box, alongside Matthew's wedding band. It was a reminder that her lineage was made of something tougher than bone and muscle. It was made of stubbornness. The darkness of the night was broken by a low sound, the creak of wagon wheels. Eleanor grabbed Matthew's old shotgun, her heart pounding, but the figure that emerged from the shadows was not a soldier. It was Amos Chambers, her neighbor to the east, a man as old and wrinkled as walnut bark, whose eyes had seen the smoke rise from the Alamo. He stopped his wagon near the dry well and, without a word, began unloading 2 large barrels of water. That son of a bitch thinks he can starve Texas dry, Amos grumbled, more to himself than to her. He doesn't understand anything. Eleanor lowered the gun, gratitude and relief washing over her. Amos, they'll come after you for this. The old man spat on the ground. Let 'em try. I'm too old to run and too mad to hide. He looked at her, his eyes clear and sharp. But listen, girl, fighting him with gunpowder is exactly what he wants. Merritt loves a good excuse to play the victim and bring in more troops. He doesn't understand honor. That kind of man only understands two things: power and paper. And his power comes from a piece of paper he made up himself. Amos's words planted a seed in Eleanor's mind. Fighting with force was impossible, but fighting with wits, that was a territory the general, in his arrogance, would never expect her to explore. From that night on, her despair transformed into a cold, sharp purpose. She began to observe. Every morning, she saw this all. Generals' messengers coming and going, always heading east towards the port. She started going into town again, not to buy or sell, but to listen. In the general store, she heard soldiers' wives complaining about delayed payments. In the saloon, she overheard businessmen whispering about land deals with foreign investors whose names no one could pronounce. She pieced it together. Merritt wasn't taking land for the progress of Texas. He was stealing it to sell to a foreign consortium, pocketing a fortune. The decrees he brandished were a sham, a legal cover, or a massive corruption scheme. She needed proof. Amos, using contacts from his days as a Texas Ranger, discovered something crucial. A young surveyor, Benjamin Price, who had worked for Merritt, had been abruptly fired and disappeared after questioning the legitimacy of the maps he was sent to draw. Rumor had it he was hiding somewhere near the border, terrified. On Thursday night, the eve of Merritt's deadline, a dust storm swept across the region, an orange veil that swallowed the world. It was the perfect cover. Eleanor saddled her horse, taking only a canteen of water and a bag of dry bread. She left a lantern burning in the kitchen window, a small lie for the general's watchful eyes. General Marshal Merritt slept soundly in his confiscated mansion, the sleep of tyrants, convinced he had broken the lone woman of the Green Ranch. He never imagined that, as he dreamed of gold and power, Eleanor Green was riding against the wind, not fleeing, but hunting. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking something infinitely more dangerous to a man like Merritt: the truth. And in Texas, truth, once unleashed, rides faster and with more fury than any horse. Eleanor's journey was a test of endurance against the elements and fear. The wind howled, dust scratched her lungs, and every shadow seemed to hide the general's men. But the image of Merritt's arrogant face and the memory of the promise made to Matthew drove her on. She found Benjamin Price in a miserable cabin, hidden in a forgotten canyon. He was a young man, broken by terror. His eyes widened upon seeing her, thinking she was an envoy from the general sent to silence him for good. "I don't want any trouble," he stammered, retreating into the cabin's darkness. Eleanor didn't threaten or beg him. She simply sat on the only wobbly chair in the place and told her story. She spoke of the land, of the diverted creek, of the community poisoned by fear. She didn't speak of justice or revenge, but of something he could understand: dignity. "He took my livelihood, Mr. Price. Soon he will take my home. But what he took from you was your honor. And a man can live without land, but he cannot live without honor." Her words, spoken with disarming calm, hit their mark. Benjamin Price, who had lived for months gnawed by guilt, saw in Eleanor not a threat, but a chance for redemption. With trembling hands, he unearthed a metal box from beneath the floorboards. Inside were the documents, copies of the true deeds, the original maps, and, most importantly, the letters exchanged between Merritt and the foreign investors, detailing the entire fraudulent scheme. It was the dynamite she needed. The return journey was even more perilous. She avoided the roads, cutting through wasteland, the leather bag with the documents tied to her chest as if it were her own heart. When she returned to her ranch, Friday's sun was already breaking the horizon. The deadline had arrived, and with it, the general. He came with a dozen men not to negotiate but to execute the repossession. He stopped his horse in front of the porch, a triumphant smile on his face. "Good morning, Mrs. Green. I trust your bags are packed?" She didn't answer. She simply watched him, standing in the same place as before. Her silence, which had once irked him, now amused him. It was, to him, the silence of final defeat. But something was different. Behind her, emerging slowly from the house, was Amos Chambers, his old shotgun resting on his arm. And from the surrounding hills, other figures began to appear. Farmers, merchants, men and women who for days had turned their faces away. Alerted by Amos during the night, they had come, not armed for battle, but to bear witness. Eleanor's silent courage had, at last, shamed their fear. That night, in town, General Merritt was hosting a lavish ball in the main hall of the town hall. It was a celebration of his victory, with representatives of foreign investors in attendance. Whiskey flowed freely, music played loud, and Merritt preened, accepting compliments for having pacified the region and paved the way for progress. He raised his glass for a toast. "To a prosperous future! To Texas!" It was at that precise moment that the ballroom doors flew open. The music stopped. Conversations died. Eleanor Green stood at the entrance. She wasn't dressed for a ball. She wore her work clothes, clean, but worn. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun. There was dust on her boots. In her hands, she carried nothing. She was the personification of the land these men celebrated plundering. Merritt's face contorted into a mask of fury. "What is the meaning of this? Guards, remove this woman!" But Eleanor moved. She walked across the ballroom, the sound of her boots on the polished floor the only noise in the sepulchral silence. The guests parted, making way as if a force of nature were passing through them. She looked at no one. Her eyes were fixed solely on the general. She stopped a few feet from him, and then, the moment that would give rise to legends. She said not a word. She shouted no accusations. She brandished no proof. She simply stared at him. In her gaze, there was no hatred, no fear, no plea. There was the weight of generations of hard work, the strength of the oak on the hill, the clarity of a clean conscience. It was a gaze that stripped him bare, that reduced him from a powerful general to a common thief. Merritt laughed, a nervous, shrill sound. "Have you gone mad, woman? Do you think you can intimidate me with this theater?" Behind him, on the sides of the ballroom, Amos Chambers and two other farmers began distributing papers. They were copies of Benjamin Price's documents. The foreign investors were the first to pick them up. Their faces went from confusion to concern and then to icy fury as they realized they were being cheated, that the land titles they had bought were worthless. The local politicians who had supported Merritt out of fear or greed paled as they saw the irrefutable proof of fraud in their hands. The general's power, built on a mountain of lies and intimidation, crumbled in seconds. His prestige, his authority, all evaporated under the silent gaze of a woman and the rustle of papers. Panicked, he drew his pistol. "Traitors! All of you!" He aimed it at Eleanor, but his own soldiers, positioned near the door, didn't move. They too had seen the proof. They, who had families and small properties, understood that the man they worked for was using them to rob people like them. Their commander was not a leader. He was a criminal. When the town sheriff, a man who had hitherto cowered in Merritt's presence, walked towards him with a pair of handcuffs, the general finally broke. He was no longer a conqueror. He was just a small, frightened man whose only weapon, fear, had turned against him. There was no applause when they took Marshal Merritt away. There was only a deep, respectful silence. People turned to Eleanor, and the men, one by one, removed their hats. It was not a salute to a warrior, but an apology to a neighbor whose strength they had underestimated. Here, where fear had once reigned, the wind now blew free, as if Texas itself had breathed a sigh of relief. In the months that followed, justice ran its course. Marshal Merritt was tried in military court, stripped of his rank, and sentenced to a long prison term for corruption and treason. The deals with the investors were annulled, and the lands, including those already taken, were returned to their rightful owners. Life in the valley returned to normal, but something had changed forever. Eleanor Green did not become a political figure or a hailed heroine. She refused all offers of recognition. Her prize was the sound of water running in the creek again, the green of corn growing strong under the sun, the peaceful silence of her ranch. The community, now united by a redeeming shame, helped her repair the fence and rebuild what had been destroyed. The respect they gave her was not loud, but deep and lasting. She had taught them a fundamental lesson about the soul of Texas. True courage was not measured by the caliber of a gun or the volume of a voice. It was measured by the ability to stand tall in silence when everything around you tries to bring you down. The justice she achieved came not from revenge, but from truth. Merritt, in his cell, was imprisoned not just by iron bars, but by the weight of his own dishonor. Eleanor, on her land, was free. That was the true victory. A year later, on an autumn afternoon, she walked to the top of the hill and stood beneath the old oak. The wind blew gently through the leaves, and the sound seemed to carry a whisper, the echo of old stories. The name of Crockett, the powerful, had called her husband a mere farmer, and her a stubborn fool. The people now called her a heroine, but she knew the truth. Courage needs no witnesses or titles. It just needs a reason. And her reason was there, beneath her feet, breathing with her. The land belonged not to those who conquered it, but to those who loved it enough not to abandon it. If you enjoyed this story and identify with the pride and strength that run in the veins of our people, subscribe to the channel. Share it with everyone who believes that silent courage can change the world. And don't forget to comment from where you're watching us, so we know how far the spirit of freedom travels.